with Drexel and University of Pennsylvania students for a number of years. So I'm glad to be able to have the opportunity to share who we are and what we've been doing. And I'm going to give you a quick slideshow presentation, a little bit about our history and what we're doing right now, and then open up for whatever questions you might have. Does that sound good? All right. So let's see if I can get started here on my presentation. All right. Am I sharing the screen all right now?
Yep.
Okay, very good. All right. So I'm the executive director of PowerUp Gambia. We work on solar power solutions for healthcare in the Gambia in West Africa. And I've been with the organization for about 10 years now. And it's mostly an all volunteer organization. I'm part-time paid staff, but I'm the only paid staff. We basically do most of all of our work by volunteers and interns. So I'll get started a little bit about why we exist. I mean, this is the familiar sight that we're all very used to, right? When you go into our world, United States, electricity is not an issue. You have it available, it's available everywhere. You don't even really think about it. The only time we ever have any problems with it is if we have major storms, and even then, it's generally out for a short period of time. And you forget about how critical electricity is for the healthcare sector. It's really vital, from running lights, air conditioning, life support systems, diagnostic testing, blood banks, all of this stuff. You really need reliable electricity, and you need to have it available 24/7. You can't have it going on and going off at different times. But, you know, when you think about it, when you look at the world, there's really inequity in who has and who does not have electricity, who has access to energy. When you look at this map of basically the world at night, it's just very clear right up front who has the electricity, who has access to power, and who does not. When you look at Africa, you know, you look at the continent is 3 times the size of the United States. Look at the amount of light electricity that is there compared to the United States. And it's not that there's not many people in Africa. You know, there's 1.3 billion people who live in Africa compared to the United States, which is 360 million. And yet you can see with just a glance right now, the inequity on who has energy access, who has electricity, and who does not. And that impacts healthcare. It impacts healthcare throughout Africa. Here is at Bansang Hospital. Previously, you know, I showed a picture of the nurse attending a neonatal unit, in the neonatal unit, infant in distress. She has all the access in the United States, all the electricity that she needs. This is Bansang Hospital when they had no power. The mother had passed away, the infant was in critical condition, and they basically are trying to tend to it by flashlights. They have an incubator. The incubator doesn't work, there's no electricity. And, you know, despite their best efforts, the child passed away. And this is a common occurrence, and it's totally unnecessary. It does not have to be. So we work in the Gambia. The Gambia is one of the smallest countries in Africa. You can see the little dot right there. It's located just on the western edge along the Atlantic Ocean, and it is surrounded by Senegal. It's a former British colony. The British at one point, when they were all competing for colonies, took a gunboat up the Gambia River and basically claimed territory as far as the gunboat could shoot on either side. Hence this long, narrow country that goes all the way up into Senegal. Gambia is one of the poorest countries in the world, one of the poorest countries even within Africa. And it's, the majority of people are subsistence farmers. They grow peanuts, rice, millet, and you don't generate a lot of income with peanuts and rice and millet. So it's a fairly poor country that does not have a lot of resources. It does not have coal, does not have minerals, it does not have much of anything that is of quote interest to the developed world. So it's pretty much been ignored by many of the Western world. But the Gambia is rich in one resource in that it has a lot of sunlight. And so it has potential, great potential for using solar energy to build its economy. PowerUp Gambia was actually started by a sophomore, undergraduate sophomore at University of Pennsylvania. She was interested in going into medicine and wanted to do a summer abroad. Signed up with this group, Crossroads Africa, and they stationed her in this remote hospital in the middle of Gambia and said, okay, figure out what you're gonna do. So she basically worked as a nurse assistant at the hospital and absolutely fell in love. They call the Gambia the smiling coast of Africa. And it is one of the nicest, warmest, most hospitable places I've ever been to and I've ever worked. But after her time there, at the time, Buyam Hospital had no access to utility grid. What power it did have, it had by its own on-site generators, which constantly were failing and falling apart. And they couldn't afford the fuel for the generators anyway. So Catherine, when she was leaving, she really wanted to do something for the hospital. So she approached the CEO of the hospital, and that's Mr. Kebabaji, who's standing to the side there on this photo. And she asked Mr. Badgie, she said, when I go back to the United States, I want to raise some funds to help the hospital. And what would be the best thing for me to raise funds for? And she was thinking about, you know, maybe vaccines, some drugs, some bandages or something like that. And he said, I want solar power for my hospital. Now this was, 14, 15 years ago. This was kind of unheard of in the Gambia. And she said, well, I don't know anything about solar power. And he says, I've been researching it and I have a quote and this is what we need and this is what we want. And can you do this for me? And so she thought, well, why not? So, she started it totally naive, knowing nothing about solar power, knowing nothing about fundraising. But she wanted to do something and she was passionate about it. And that was really what it took. It really took passion and energy, which Catherine, now Dr. Hall, has in abundance. So anyway, Catherine came back, she met with a lot of people, she got connected with Rotary International, she started reaching out to other undergraduates at Penn and at Drexel, and formed this group, PowerUp Gambia, to try and raise money to put solar power in the hospital. Their first project was a water project, basically did a borehole with solar panels and water pumping so that the hospital would have a reliable water. Before this time, they basically had to truck water in and just had them in buckets. So washing up for surgery, you were basically washing out of a bucket with no running water. So this was the first time that they actually had running water. She continued on with the fundraising. She was very successful. She was a very dynamic speaker. And in the end, she got enough funding to put together a 12 kilowatt off-grid solar power system with battery backup for the hospital. And this is at the inauguration back in 2009. So it took a lot of effort on her part, but this was at the time the biggest system in the Gambia. Nobody had ever done this before, and it was quite a feat. It attracted an awful lot of attention. And so originally she had thought that this would be kind of like a one-off project. She'd do this, then she'd go on to medical school, and that would be the end of PowerUp Gambia. But so many people and so many clinics and health facilities approached her and said, can we have something like this? That she decided to start PowerUp Gambia as an actual a nonprofit charity organization, and to try and do this in more than just one hospital in the Gambia. And that's when I got started with PowerUp Gambia. This is the system at Buyam General Hospital. You can see we've got the solar panels on trackers. At the time it was built, it was an off-grid system, battery backup. Those are lead acid batteries there. SMA inverters and SMA Sunny Island battery chargers for the system. And this was probably at the time the most sophisticated solar power system in the Gambia. But as we started looking at approaching how we would do more facilities, it became clear to me that we had to have a very systematic approach. You can't just plop a project down and walk away. You have to think about training the people who are going to be installing it. You have to think about sustainability. How are you going to replace components? Get hit by a lightning strike in a clinic, it might blow out an inverter. You know, if you have 12 different types of inverters, well, that's going to be a problem. You need to know what you have. You need to have backup materials. You need to have kind of a system. And so one of the things we did was we looked at some of the real rural remote clinics where there was absolutely no electricity. And for a lot of them, they just simply needed lights. They needed a way for the nurses to charge their cell phones so that they could call if they needed to refer patients on. And we started working with this one group, We Care Solar, which is a fantastic organization out of Berkeley. And they had a solar suitcase, which is a plug and play unit that was really focusing on providing support for labor wards, maternity wards in these rural clinics. And maternal deaths and infant mortality is very high in Africa. And we really thought that that would be an effective way to really provide power where it was most needed. Then we started looking at, okay, in larger clinics, maybe where there's electricity available, but it's unreliable, we could do a 1 to 3 kilowatt power system with battery backup for these types of facilities, basically the larger clinics. So they can run lights, refrigerator, a vaccine refrigerator, have some diagnostic laboratory equipment available, that type of thing. And then we started thinking about, well, for phase 3, in some of the hospital locations, you really need to go larger. You need to go 64, 84 kilowatts. Most of these places have access to electricity grid, but in most of Africa, many countries, the grid is unreliable. It'll be up for a few hours in the day, down for a few hours in the day. You never know when it's going to be on and when it's going to be off. So we wanted to do basically hybrid power systems that have battery backup, but are also net metered so that if we have excess power, we can send it to the grid and basically bank that electricity for use at a later day. And so that's kind of the model that we're using now. As I said, our first phase 1 is these plug and play off-grid DC solar systems. They're very simple. They're about 120 watts. The design is We Care Solar. And these are very robust little systems that were designed by Laura Stachel, Dr. Laura Stachel from We Care Solar. She's an obstetrician who was working in Nigeria and was constantly trying to work in difficult situations with women in difficult labor with no lights, or lights would go out suddenly, or they were trying to use candles. And when she came back home, she told her husband, who was an engineer, I want a solar power system that I can put in a suitcase and take with me to whatever clinic I go. And that was the idea for the solar suitcases. We've been working with We Care Solar. We now have solar suitcases in 58 clinics in the Gambia. As I say, they're very simple systems to install, a single panel. You mount the suitcase right on the wall. All the components are right there, connected up. It has the DC lights that go with it, all of the charging equipment, fetal heart monitor, so that the nurses and midwives can attend to the women in labor. And it's been very, very successful and really, really well appreciated by the nurses and midwives in many of these clinics. Here you see one of the DC lights, and that's really, this is at night. This shows how bright it really can light up the room with these WeCare solar suitcases, so that the nurses are not struggling to see what's going on. They're not struggling to try and tend to the infants. They can really see what's going on, handle everything properly. Makes a huge difference. At our phase 2, we are looking at doing, 1 to 3 kilowatt solar power systems that would be for the larger clinics. Now, we haven't really pursued this because as we started working with it, we realized that we were actually getting more impact for putting in our solar suitcases in as many clinics as possible. So the very basics of lighting was available. And then we also started looking at the fact that really hospitals were key, because the clinics, everybody refers up to the hospitals. The patients who arrive at the hospitals are often in desperate need, and the hospitals really need that 24-hour electricity. And so we've been focusing on what I call our phase 3, the hospital power systems. This is Buyam Hospital. As you can see, it's a large complex. It's got multiple buildings, starting with, your outpatient clinics, your surgeries, your patient wards, and you can see our little original 12 kilowatt system right down there. It was a huge plus for the hospital when it was first put in, because they could have lighting, they could run the lab. But we definitely needed to do larger systems. And at this time, when I was working with PowerUp Gambia, the electricity grid from the national electricity grid had come up to this area. And so they were able to connect to the grid for the first time, but the grid was totally unreliable. It was on for a few hours and then it was off for a few hours, and the electricity was very expensive and was kind of difficult for them to try and budget for. And so we just decided that what we really needed to do was go with a much larger system. Net metering, I'm sure most of you are aware of what net metering is. It's basically a way to trade power back and forth to your grid, where when you have excess power, you can basically use it in your hospital. You can charge your batteries with it, but you can send excess out to the grid, and you basically run your meter backwards, so that you're building up some credit with the grid, the utility company. Then later at night, you basically, when the grid is available, you can draw from the grid and kind of get that credit back and use their electricity without having to tap your batteries. Now that's very important because batteries are kind of the weak link. Energy storage is one of the major stumbling blocks for all of these solar power systems. And so if you can conserve your batteries for when you really need them, when basically the grid goes down, you're at night, you need to be running power, that's when you tap into your batteries. So this net metering, where you can kind of build up a credit of power and then subtract that credit when you need it and only tap your batteries when it's really critically important, that can really help the hospital reduce cost, reduce excess loading of the battery bank, and really make the system very effective. So when we did when we did our first power system, we basically, as you can see down in the right-hand corner here, we had a little 12 kilowatt system right here. We basically took that 12 kilowatt system and we expanded it with new arrays, new inverters, so that it would be both a battery backup system and a net metered system that could both connect with the grid, as you see up here on the top, and also connect with the generator. Because one of the things we found with experience is there were times when the grid would go down for 2 or 3 days in the rainy season. Well, we would have clouds for 2 or 3 days at the same time. That put tremendous stress on the batteries. The solar powers just couldn't generate enough power for the hospital and charge the batteries. So every now and then it was important to be able to access a generator. Generators are very expensive to run, but it would be enough to basically run the generator, take a load off the batteries for a period of time until we could get more sunlight and get them fully charged. So this was the system, and this is the system that we're moving to. And I'll just walk you through some slides. This was the old solar power system. We had our contractor from the Gambia, Greenlink, come in and work with our engineers to basically go through, check all the inverters, clean everything, get everything, make sure everything was performing to spec. We worked with the hospital, and this is the hospital maintenance staff, and they basically built the solar array. We had diagrams for them, we demonstrated how to do it, and they loved this project. They took a lot of pleasure in it. They really had took a lot of ownership in what they were doing. They were building the solar power system for the hospital. And this is Modu, you see there, he's the chief of the maintenance staff there. And this was really important. We could have come in on our own with volunteers or paid contractors and built it all, but we really wanted to engage the hospital maintenance staff. We paid them a small stipend to do the work, basically $8 a day per person. And they were just delighted. They showed up early for work, stayed late for work, and got it built really very great job in no time at all. And what was interesting is, so we trained the staff, the hospital maintenance staff, to build the arrays. Then they got a call from the Gambia Technical Training Institute saying, we want to bring a class out to show them how you're building your solar arrays. So then the maintenance staff trained the students how to build one of the arrays. So we trained the maintenance staff, and then the maintenance staff were training students. So it was really kind of wonderful to see. And as I say, they did a great job. This is the extended array that's going in. We now have basically a 64 kilowatt system going up from the 12 kilowatt to 64 kilowatt system at the hospital. To the left-hand side here, this is kind of the battery backup component. You've got batteries, you've got your inverters and chargers and all. And so if the grid goes down, the power, it automatically switches to the battery system. The hospital doesn't see any interruption in power whatsoever. It continues on, and so that they have no interruption in any of the work that they're doing in surgery or any of the instruments that they're running. The other component basically were these inverters that are just net metered. They don't connect to the battery system, but they will send excess power out first to the hospital, and then anything that's left over goes out to the grid. We are working with Greenlink. This is Greenlink's engineer who came in from the Netherlands. Oops, sorry. And our board member engineer, Ron, who was also there volunteering for the project. We've also worked on energy efficiency, installing LED lights in the clinics and in the hospitals to reduce the energy load. It's very important to protect the batteries and make sure they're not discharged too much by too heavy a load. And we've also worked on training. We've worked with the Gambia Technical Training Institute. We've sent some of their instructors for training in Ghana, and so that they can learn a little bit more about solar power, and that they can basically provide training for young students, some of whom will then go out and be assigned to work at the hospitals. We also have solar technicians at the hospitals that we work on training. In the middle here is Sekou, learning basically how to test batteries, maintain systems, make sure that everything is working properly, and then able to communicate clearly to any of the contractors if there's any problems on the system. It's really important to have that. that linkage because we can't be there to see what's going on, and the contractor's not going to be going out there on a regular business. So you really have to have, on these larger systems, you have to have a trained technician on site who can monitor the system. But we're also hugely dependent on volunteers and interns from the United States, basically from University of Pennsylvania and from Drexel. We have on the left a Penn student who was working at the hospital. Here on the right, also a Drexel student, Mengi, who was working on repairing equipment at the hospital. And these volunteers go out and work for us. Oftentimes they're not working directly on PowerUp Gambia projects. Sometimes they're assisting on our projects, but they're also embedded in the hospital so that they're working on projects that is of interest to the hospital and important for the hospital, and also being able to apply their own skills in a setting that's very different from the kind of hospital you might work in here in the United States. Here's some more interns. Over on the left, we have Corey and Matt in their festival costumes, well-dressed. Matt in the back was a Drexel biomedical engineering student who worked at the hospital on repairing equipment and training the technicians repairing equipment, particularly oxygen concentrators, which are so critical. Respiratory illnesses in children is the third leading cause of death in the world. You don't think about it, but a lot of children die from respiratory illnesses. The pneumonias, they can, by the time, if they don't have oxygen therapy, by the time medicines take effect, basically the children suffocate. So oxygen concentrators are hugely important. We have one of our other volunteers went out with the Ministry of Health teams that were installing the solar suitcases for us in We Care Solar. And he had quite an adventure for a month, traveling the length and breadth of the Gambia, installing systems in about 40 clinics. So that's basically PowerUp Gambia. This is what we do. We've stayed focused in the Gambia because we really feel it's important to do not just a scattered project here or there, but to work within the Ministry of Health and to try and support kind of an overall infrastructure improvement that affects all of the hospitals. And so that's kind of been our philosophy. And we're, as I say, we're basically a volunteer organization, and we always have been. But it's a major part of who we are. And we have a lot of close ties to the Gambia. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to travel there right now because of travel restrictions. But we hope to be doing Bansang Hospital soon. It'll be very much like the hospital project I've shown you. We'll work with the hospital staff for the installation of the panels. And it will be very, very important. Bansang Hospital is very far from the capital, very remote, but a very, very busy hospital, and they're in desperate need of reliable electricity. So that's PowerUp Gambia. And with that, I think I will just go ahead and say, be happy to answer any questions anybody might have.
So yeah, if anyone has questions right now, feel free to ask. And then I also have a list of questions that people have been sending in that we can go off of, but if anybody wants to ask them themselves, feel free.
I've got one. So if you had one piece of advice that you wish you would have known when you started out, what would it be? Like when you started out, what was one thing you wish you had known?
That developing clear lines of communication is critical. One of the biggest issues when you go into a country and you're working on a project is you're a guest, all right? So certain cultural rules apply to you that wouldn't apply otherwise, which means people don't want to tell you bad news, right? So you don't find out about problems because that would be impolite. They don't necessarily want to stress you by giving you the bad news. here in the United States, we're used to, you know, you walk into the room on a project, if something's going wrong, boom, you're hit with that right away. People tell you right away, it's not working, this is going wrong. You don't get that. You certainly don't get that in the Gambia. And so it's easy to be deceived. You have to sit down, you have to take your time, you have to coax the communication, particularly the communication of anything that's going wrong. And people won't share that with you until they're comfortable with you. So one of the biggest issues with us as Americans, we like to rush into an area and we like to get started right away. That's not the best way sometimes to do it. Sometimes you really have to give yourself time. You have to give yourself time to look around, talk casually with people, get them comfortable, and then you can really start talking about the nitty-gritty of the project, and they'll start sharing the reality of the situation. They will never tell you right up front, this is a bad idea, this isn't going to work. They'll never share that, not until they're very comfortable with you, and then they'll kind of hint that maybe there's a problem, and then you kind of have to coax it out. So it's a long process, and you have, as an American, you have to learn to kind of like slow down, listen more, ask leading questions, but, you know, kind of take your time and build that communication link.
Thank you. That was some great advice.
Yeah.
I have a question kind of going off of that. As you guys have been working with them and sort of gone back to the same locations and stuff, have you seen changes in that communication? Like, obviously there's different people kind of going each time and it's not always going to be exactly the same people. Have they sort of started to open up in general to people from your organization, or is it something that's still like, as you go, it's still like the individual person has to sort of build that relationship? Have you noticed like a change, I guess, as they get used to realizing that you guys are there to work and help and like overcome the battles?
Yeah, well, for me, I've built those linkages over time, so it's fairly good with me. And I have to say, technology now has made it so much easier. You know, I've been sitting at my desk here in the US and I'm able to do a Zoom meeting and talk with people about, you know, what's going on at the hospital and how they're going to be, you know, doing things. But for each person who goes, it's the same process. We always tell volunteers and interns who go is like, your first week, you're not going to do anything. At least your first week, maybe your first 2 weeks. Just listen to people, kind of get an idea of what's going on, and don't, you know, don't try to rush the communications, but be open, you know, and build that. So each person who goes in kind of has to redo that for themselves. But yeah, one of the advantages of working in the Gambia and coming back over and over again is I now know, you know, who I can talk to, who's going to give me the straight scoop on what's going on. And they know that I'm not going to get upset if like somebody did something wrong with the equipment, which happens fairly frequently. That happens here in the United States. People mess with equipment and screw things up, you know. They know I'm not going to go ballistic and have a meltdown. So, you know, they're comfortable about telling me about what happened.
Thank you.
So some of the other questions that people were asking is, what was the biggest difficulty technically with the project, culturally, working remotely, or problem that you had to overcome?
Well, I would say technically the biggest problem with the project has always been energy storage. Hopefully we're going to get past that because we're starting to move out of lead acid batteries to lithium ion. But these systems are at the hospitals, they're hammered hard, very hard. The systems are used very heavily, and you know, all these design specs that they give you for equipment, my God, they were made in labs in Europe and the United States. That's not the conditions we're working under in the Gambia, the heat, the humidity, the dust, it's very, very hard on electrical equipment. So that was one of the things I had to kind of wrap my head around, is like, just because, you know, a battery, you know, we do all of our calculations and it's supposed to last for, 6 years, and then you realize that you're starting to get degradation at the end of year 2. You realize that you have to monitor these systems very closely, and you have to expect failures. There's the equipment in Africa, electronic equipment, the environmental conditions are very, very hard on electronic equipment, very hard. The panels hold up very well, but some of the other components, you know, we had one inverter we were using, a Victron inverter, and it had a regular fan for cooling the inverter. The amount of dust that builds up inside those inverters in a short period of time, you know, didn't occur to me that we would need to get basically a blower to the hospital maintenance staff, because they had to blow out the inverter basically and get that dust out of there every month. Otherwise, it just heated up too much, and we were starting to get failures, you know, within months after the inverters were put into place. So you really have to keep your eyes open and try and anticipate problems and jump on them where you can. And that's where communication is so important as well.
Another thing, I'm trying to just like find what hasn't really been touched on yet. Has access to electricity extended beyond or benefited more than just hospitals?
Well, I think, I mean, obviously the schools are very interested in getting regular electricity in. Businesses are, a lot of them, you know, businesses basically shut up when they don't have electricity. You've got a lot of welders, you've got a lot of other businesses that would want to have refrigeration, cooling, things like that. It's a real drag on the economy. You really can't grow very much if you don't have access to energy. The Gambia is small enough that the World Bank is actually investing a huge amount of money to put solar power both in the Gambia and Senegal. But the Gambia has a lot of small villages that are very remote, and it doesn't make sense to run electrical lines out to them when you have basically a village that has 50 people in it, and it's miles from any electrical line. You know, in that case, something like solar, where it's distributed generation, that makes much more sense than trying to basically run electrical lines all over the country when the country is, you know, people are spread out and it's not densely populated in the rural areas.
Yeah, that makes sense. Also, again, if anyone,
I have a question. How did you personally get involved in this project?
Well, it was interesting. So I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer. After college, I joined Peace Corps, and I was a forestry agent in Senegal. As you remember, Gambia is kind of inserted into Senegal. So shares very much same culture, same ethnic groups. So I really enjoyed my time in Peace Corps. I was intending to work internationally. I got sidelined doing other projects in the United States. But to be honest, when I shipped my kids off to college, I was like, I'm gonna go back into international work. So right at that time, Catherine was starting medical school and realized she could not continue to run PowerUp Gambia. So they were looking for somebody to step in as the executive director. And I love West Africa. And it just, I had solar panels on my house. I'm a firm believer in renewable energy potential in other places. So it was just kind of a natural fit, kind of just fell into it. I was lucky.
Sorry. So something else someone asked was, is there a reason why the power grid is unreliable? Are there projects that could be done by the government to fix the country's infrastructure as a whole rather than patch projects? So I guess projects like in very localized areas.
Yeah. The issue of unreliability is both technical and economic. The Gambia has no fossil fuels. So they basically generate electricity by importing diesel and heavy fuel oil. And their generators are the ones that basically power the grid. Generation of electricity by using generators, burning diesel and fuel oil is like the most expensive way to generate electricity. But socially, they want to have electricity rates that people can actually afford. So that means that the utility company is generating electricity at basically 35 cents a kilowatt hour and selling it for basically 18 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, as you can see, they very quickly run out of money. So they can't upgrade their equipment. And once they provide electricity to an area, everybody who before had candles, you know, first they go and they get lights, and then they get a fan, and then they get a refrigerator and a TV and an air conditioner, and you know, and so pretty soon the generating station that the utility grid has set up is beyond capacity. All right, they can't meet the load demand. So they have to start doing load shedding. And they do load shedding on a regular basis by basically flipping switches off. And it's like, okay, this part of the country is going down. And they just turn it off. When they have maintenance issues, sometimes it'll take them 2 or 3 weeks to get a part in for these old generators because they don't make those parts anymore. And they can't afford to get new generators. And so it's this kind of like this constant spiral where they can't get ahead. And so they can't maintain the equipment, and the demand just keeps growing and they can't meet the demand. And that's why you get these unpredictable load sheddings and power grids going down and taking forever to come back up. And it's not just in the Gambia. This happens everywhere, where basically power is so expensive to generate and distribute, and yet they can't. The tariff that the consumer pays is kept, you know, artificially low to try and stimulate growth of the economy.
That's so interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
Someone else had asked that they saw a lot of sophisticated components in the first system that you had showed in the presentation. Where did you buy the components, like the panels, inverters, and batteries? How do you pick vendors, and how do you think about maintenance, fixing the systems before purchasing the materials?
So most of our equipment comes out of Europe, and that's because most of the contractors that we work with in the Gambia, their connections are with companies in Europe. The first system, the 12 kilowatt system that was put in by a Gambian contract company that had a German engineer who lives in the Gambia, and he started the company with his partner who's Gambian. They basically wrote away for, you know, all the parts and the engineering, and when it arrived, they didn't really know how to install it properly. It was more sophisticated. They had been doing water pumping systems, solar water pumping systems, but this was way beyond anything that they had tried before. And so there were some major problems with it. The quality of the equipment, SMA is, they have great equipment, but it's quirky. You kind of really have to know the system well. I'm not sure I would have jumped into that sophisticated a system right away. But they did. We had to make do with it. We struggled with it for a while, but we've stayed with the SMAs because they are very reliable and they're pretty robust. But it's finding good contractors has been a major issue, and training. We really want to do more training and get more Gambian engineers. Gambia is really very, very short of engineers. When the British set up their university system in the Gambia, they were training people for government. They did not focus on engineering at all. I mean, after all, it was a colony. They were just supposed to turn out some lawyers and some governing people and produce peanuts for the British. They weren't supposed to have their own engineers. Why would they need their own engineers? So the Gambia really has struggled with technical expertise. They really do have to kind of import it. That's starting to change. The younger generation of Gambians are very interested in going into the hard sciences and looking at some of the technical fields. And so we're starting to see a major shift. So I'm hoping that we can sponsor some Gambians to do some good quality engineering courses and do the training that they need to move the program forward.
Yeah, that's awesome too that you want to sponsor, like you were saying, local Gambians to be able to like further their education that way and kind of rebuild the economy through investing in the local people.
Yeah, that's very important. We're not going to be around forever. So at some point, this will all be for naught if there aren't Gambians who are basically trained and able to step forward and take over, and so that we're not needed anymore.
Right. On that same note, someone also was wondering, do you keep maintenance plans and who's in charge of projects after you leave?
We normally, so we're working with a current contractor called Greenlink, who is working fairly well for us. We have them on a maintenance contract, but as I say, they don't have people, you know, for the hospitals, they don't have people at the hospital. We have to have basically train our own technicians from the maintenance staff to be able to communicate any issues, any problems, and do some of the basic maintenance. Every large hospital has their own electrician, so we normally work with their electrician and try to get them some solar training and get them some experience on that so that they can handle that. For the smaller systems, the solar suitcases, one of the reasons why we wanted to work through the Ministry of Health is we wanted them to assemble a team that we would support so that their team went out and did the installations and really did the training and knew these systems forward and backwards. So it was basically a Ministry of Health project that we supported rather than a PowerUp Gambia project. If you can see kind of like what the difference is. The focus is the Ministry of Health ran the project with our support. And I think that's important because then their people are in charge. Their people are the ones who are installing it, communicating with the healthcare workers, training the healthcare workers on how to run the system. And that's part of building that sustainability. Now they still need our support. They don't have the funds in hand to get the replacement batteries or any other extra components that they want. So we still are providing a supporting role, but it's a Ministry of Health program now, which is what we wanted it to be.
Definitely. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask now? If not, I can just keep going with the list. We have about 5 more minutes left, so. Some of these were touched on. But how has it been managing remote aspects of the solar projects? What steps did you have to take to ensure that the maintenance staff was able to both like maintain the systems and communicate what was wrong with them?
It's been very frustrating. The maintenance issue is we're still struggling with it. For the solar suitcases, they don't need much maintenance. They're pretty straightforward. They're the plug and play. But what we found is that there's a lot of turnover in the clinics, staff turnover. So we'll train someone how to use the system, what to look for, how to communicate to us if there's any problems. That staff member might then go on to another clinic. The new person comes in. They don't know anything about the system. They turn it on, it doesn't work. And people are so used to equipment breaking down that sometimes the new person would be, they'll just shrug, you know, and they'll be like, oh, it's broken. And they won't let us know. Whereas if we knew, we could get maybe a very quick, easy fix and get it up and running again. What I would like to do is have remote monitoring, but we're struggling on that issue because not internet connection or even cell phone connection is spotty in some areas. The solar suitcases don't come with monitors themselves, so we'd have, you know, so we're struggling with that. We don't have remote monitoring at Buyam or Bansang, but we're installing it. I think that's going to be a critical part. That will allow us then, if we hear that something's not working on the system, we'll be able to basically access that information and with us and the contractor, figure out as quickly as possible what the issues are.
Makes sense. Someone has their hand raised, but just super fast. I'm going to be sending out in the chat for everyone if they'd like to fill it out, like a feedback form for our second speaker series. So any comments, questions, things you would have liked to seen, if you want to fill that out. And then if not, I think we have time for one more question. So Josh, I see your hand is raised.
Hi, yeah. So I was really interested when you said that you did the hospital project with like the 58 to 80 kilowatt solar array, completely with the like technicians at the hospital. That was really like, it seems pretty amazing. I was wondering what steps you needed to do to actually plan that out in terms of like learning the system, designing it, and training people, and then having to actually implement it remotely, because like the logistics of that is something like everyone's probably struggling with right now because of COVID-19. And as a chapter, we've had projects where we've had to like start doing remotely, and it's always like, how did you go about doing that?
Yeah. Well, the Buyam Hospital, you know, we were able to have volunteers on site, and I was on site myself during the initial installation. Matt, who you saw, was a Drexel volunteer. He was also on site as well, and so we were able to work with the maintenance staff directly and kind of develop kind of like a protocol. We had engineering drawings, sat down, went over those engineering drawings with them, explained what everything was, you know, started building the array with them. And, you know, the maintenance staff, they're used to building things around the hospital all the time, and it took them no time at all to basically pick up on how to do that. The interconnection, the engineering, as far as the inverters, things like that, you really need to have trained technical staff, and that's where we rely on our contractors. And so it's been a struggle to find good contractors that you can rely on, and they need to upgrade their training as well. Working remotely is very interesting. So we want to be doing Bansang Hospital. Our equipment is on site, but you know, we're making some training videos that we're sending over. I don't know how well that's going to work. This is new for us, and we're struggling with it, to be honest.
Videos sound like a really good idea though, and I feel like that's something that I haven't heard come up in EWB USA's discussions for remote implementations. A lot of people have just been turning to contractors, but videos seem like such a more efficient way of doing remote training and such, because it's a reference for later as well. So that's awesome.
Yeah, and the videos are also very important. You know, not only do you show people and explain it to them, I think it's easier to comprehend. Like we have one skilled electrician at Bansang Hospital, Bunja. He's middle-aged. Well, he's a great electrician. He knows the hospital electrical system inside out. no problem whatsoever. He's illiterate. He's never had a chance to go to school. So we can't send him manuals. We can't send him, you know, engineering drawings. But if we show him a video and talk to him, he understands it perfectly and can implement right away. So you have to kind of understand, you know, who you're working with and how you're working with them. Now, some of the younger electricians, they're graduates from Gambia Technical Training Institute. So, you know, we could give them manuals, we could give them documentation, and they could probably use it. But even then, you know, people tend to watch videos more than they do to read manuals. So yeah, we're going to be doing more of these training videos. We Care Solar did a series of training videos for their installations, and they were very high quality. And we realized that, you know, that's actually an excellent way to move forward.
That's great. So it's 8 o'clock now. Thank you so much, Lynn, for coming and talking with us.
Pleasure.
I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did here too. If people have any additional questions, is it okay if they email you? I saw that you had your email at the end of the presentation, so.
Yes, yeah, feel free to email me. And as I say, we've worked with Drexel and students from Drexel, so it's my pleasure to continue working with you guys. Thank you so much for inviting me tonight.
Thank you. I'm
Same.